the concept of a mechitzah. Mechitzah is like to split. A mechitzah is the separation that we use to separate between men and women, or at least we're going to be talking about the mechitzah that separates between men and women, and we're going to discuss together, first of all, the source in the Talmud for the idea of a mechitzah, and then we're going to look at modern applications. When is it suitable for things to be separate, and when is it suitable for things to be mixed? Now, it's a particularly important topic because, especially here in Machon Meir, this is a new concept for many people that come here. For many people, when they're growing up, your whole life is there's sort of men and women do everything together. There's no sort of separation at all. And here we are learning in yeshiva in a men-only environment. We daven, men and women separately. Often when we go to weddings, the men and the women are sitting separately. So I think I'd like to discuss today the source of separate. When does the Talmud tell us that we separate between men and women? And from that to go to modern halachot of when is it suitable to separate men and women? And through that, I hope we'll have a sense of, when we should be in mixed company and when we should be in a separate company. Okay, is that clear for everyone? So the shiur is divided into two parts. The first part is the background sources. We're going to look at the Talmud and look at the Rambam. And then in the second part, we're going to look at modern halachic rulings on the issue of Mechitzah. And as you may notice, the two largest sections are from the writings of Rav Moshe Feinstein. And what's interesting is Rav Moshe Feinstein, in volume 1 of his book about laws of daily living, describes a mechitzah and explains when he thinks things should be separate, but he returns to the same question in volume 3. So he addresses a similar issue in volume 1 and in volume 3, but the world, he was living in New York, in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, but it could be that the situation was changing such that his position concerning when it's important to be separate. In his first source, he adds to his original ruling in volume 1 with additional considerations in volume 3. And we could discuss, and we'll look at why that might be the case. But we're going to start by the first time that we see in the Talmud. There's no mention in the Torah of a ceremony that, men and women were separate. We're not told at Ma'amad Har Sinai, in the Torah at least, that men and women were separate. In fact, it was, each family, the families were accepting the Torah. But we do see the Gemara in Masechet Sukkah tells us of a separation between men and women. If you have a look over here, it starts with a Mishnah. The Mishnah in Masechet Sukkah, Daf Nun Aleph, Amud Aleph, going on to Amud Bet. So this is the 5th perek of Masechet Sukkah, and it's talking about the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Anyone here know about the Simchat Beit HaShoeva? Very briefly, it was a huge celebration that took place every year on Sukkot in the Beit HaMikdash. As you know, there was a big altar in the forecourt of the Beit HaMikdash. Huge structure, much bigger than any of you could imagine, like a huge structure. And there was a fire always burning on this Mizbeach. Once a year, there was a water drawing ceremony. As you know, for those of you who go near the Kotel, you'll know that in Ir David there's a natural pool, Mei Shiloach, and they would draw water from outside of the Temple Mount in Ir David and bring the water from there with a great ceremony onto the altar. As you know, Sukkot is the beginning of the winter, and we pray for rain on Shmini Atzeret immediately after Sukkot. So there's a water ceremony here in Israel, as those who have been here through the year will know. It really doesn't rain at all from Pesach till Sukkot. So we've had 6, sometimes 7 months of no rain, and we're about to enter the rain season. So we take this water, and it was brought to the Beit HaMikdash. It was a huge, huge ceremony called Simchat Beit HaShoeva. And there were these lights, and the Talmud, the Mishnah, tells us how these lights, they had like these on very, very high up poles, and they had these lights. They were burning oil, and the lights lit up every courtyard in Jerusalem. They were singing and dancing, and the rabbis were juggling and celebrating on Sukkot. So the Mishnah tells us, Mi shelo ra'a simchat beit hashveva, anyone that wasn't at this ceremony, the drawing of water ceremony, anyone who never saw that ceremony, lo ra'a simcha miyamav, they never knew what joy is. True joy is to witness the simchat beit hashveva. Isn't that an amazing statement? Wow. I hope be'ezrat Hashem we all merit to see the simchat beit hashveva. Now, having with this opening remark, the Mishnah then goes on to describe various details of the ceremony. Among them, b'motzei Yom Tov Rishon, after the first day of Sukkot. So this is the first night of Chol HaMoed Sukkot. Yardul Ezrat Nashim. They would go to the Ezrat Nashim. The Ezrat Nashim, nowadays we call that the women's area. But the Ezrat Nashim in the Beit HaMikdash wasn't an area exclusively for women. It's just that was the final point that women could go to. So there were men and women in the women's area, but it was called the Ezrat Nashim because you could go. The women could be in the Ezrat Nashim, and then after the Ezrat Nashim was an area that they could not go into. So this ceremony took place in this communal area, Ezrat Nashim. However, metaknim sham tikkun gadol, but they would do a tikkun, they would fix it in some way. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara in source number 2 explains what this fixing was. What did they do? Now look at this. Amar Rav Elazar taught us, Ka'ota sheshanina chalaka hayta barishona v'hikifua gezus Torah v'hitkinu shiyu anashim yoshvot milemala v'anashim lemata. So he goes straight to the final answer. The truth is, it was a process, and maybe I'll continue reading the Breita, and then we'll come back to explain what this was. Our rabbis taught originally, hayu anashim mibifnim v'ha'anashim b'chutz. They separated the men and women. Everyone was together in this communal area, but there was a designated area for the women to stand, and there was a designated area for the men. The women were in the inner area, and the men were in the outer area. However, that didn't work because they were chatting with each other. Now we're going to come back to Hayu Ba'im Lidei Kalut Rosh. They would come to Kalut Rosh. I'm going to translate that later. Kalut Rosh, literally, the literal translation is light-headedness. I'm going to explain what that means in a minute. So it didn't work. They had men and women, they were standing next to each other and chatting. There was an area on the inner area for the women, an area for the men, but then just like a line. So we could just chat with each other. There was no boundary, and that led to Kalot Rosh, which is frivolity. Hitkinu shiu anashim yoshvot min b'chutz v'anashim b'fnim. So they thought, let's switch it the other way around. Let's have the men on the inner area and the men on the outer area. That also, sorry, I got that the wrong way around. Let's do the other way around. That the men on the inside and the women on the outside. That also didn't work. And therefore, hitkinu shiu hanashim yoshvot milemala v'ha'anashim lemata. And then they decided, and this is what Rav Elazar opened with at the beginning, the big change was they built like a gallery. And the men were on the ground level, and the women went up the stairs, and they were physically separated because the men could see the women, and the women could see the men, but you couldn't really chat with each other. You follow? So the women, everybody could experience it. Women could experience it. The men could experience it. Everybody was there enjoying the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, and everyone could see everybody else, but you couldn't chat with one another. You follow? Because the men were on one floor, one level, and the women were on a different level. You follow? Okay. So that is source number 2. That's the Gemara. Now, from the Gemara, we see that the problem is kalut rosh. Kalut rosh means frivolity, like lightheadedness. Now, I would say, I don't know to what extent this would be true. I don't know whether this reflects your experience, but every once in a while, I go to town. Like in the sense, like Rehov Yafo. In fact, I work right there on Rehov Yafo, and I wonder whether the Gemara here is talking about the fundamental difference between a group of single-sex men chatting or women chatting, or when the two come together. And often the nature of that interaction changes when people are chatting with each other. I'm not talking about in a professional setting when you're, at work, sort of if, like the staff in whatever office you work in, some are men and some are women. I think in that context, perhaps there's less difference. But in a social gathering, when there's a group of guys and then some girls join the group of guys, often the dynamic in that group changes. And I wonder whether that change in the dynamic is called kalut rosh. You hear what I'm saying? Anyone have any comments on that? Anyone happy with that sort of definition, or not happy with that definition, or have a different definition?
Just wanted to clarify, because in the Torah we have the story when they cross the Yam Suf that the women get the tambourine and they sing and dance, and for sure there's like men in there too. Why we have this? Is it like Isur? Is just Isur the Rabbanan to look at the women dancing, or am I? It's Asur to look at the woman dancing.
No, so and I want to. We haven't mentioned anything about looking at anybody until now. We haven't spoken. If you're talking about sniut or stuff like that, we haven't. If you have a look at, and that's an important point because we're going to come to that later. The concern here doesn't seem to be anything to do with sniut, and in fact, in what we've described until now, there's been no mention of sniut. Not that sniut's not a problem, but that's not the only reason. The reason that we see in the Mishnah over here is not that people are dressed this way or people are dressed that way, and it might be, you might look when you shouldn't be looking and stuff like that. That doesn't seem to be at all the direction that the Gemara is taking over here. It's talking about there's a fundamental difference between a group of guys chatting and a mixed group of people chatting, and that difference is that the difference between those two groups is one is with kalut rosh and the other one is without kalut rosh. Now I might add, just in brackets, maybe this is a bit. I don't know if this is correct, but the kalut rosh might sometimes not be terrible. Meaning, we're in the Beit Hamikdash. We're celebrating the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Kalut rosh is not the right thing right now. Like the sniut problem is obviously always a problem. I mean, I don't think kalut rosh is a great thing, but it's not a sin. You know what I mean? I didn't transgress anything through kalut rosh, but I'm just not as focused as I should be on avodat Hashem, on whatever I'm supposed to be doing right now. That the problem in a mixed setting seems to be kalut rosh. Now, your point about about Miriam and the tambourines, the Torah does tell us that Miriam danced with the women, and Midrashim speak about, there was the reason why Miriam was dancing with the women is because the women weren't part of the original Shira of Moshe Rabbeinu, because Moshe Rabbeinu was singing the Shira, and that was an experience of gratitude to Hashem for the men, And then Miriam saw that there's nothing for the women, and therefore she started dancing with the women. Is that clear to everybody? Okay, so we've defined, I think, Kalut Rosh. It's very hard to put a word on it. I sort of think Kalut Rosh, like when you see it, you know you've seen it. You know what I mean?
How we can understand Kalut Rosh?
Just go to Machne Yehuda after 10 o'clock and you'll see Kalut Rosh.
No, I understand that.
Or Zachariah, don't go to.
I want to understand the meaning. How understand
Lightheaded.
So I'll just tell you something in a different context. I know this doesn't help you at all, but in a totally different context, I know for children, children have got an excellent sense of good people and not good people. I know sometimes when, let's say we have guests, our children are older now, but when they were little, so sometimes there was a guest that would come and they'd feel like he's a bit creepy. Now, I don't know, they never said anything, but they have a sense, if it feels odd, it's probably odd. You know what I mean? Like, you have to trust your instinct. And I wonder whether Kalut Rosh is something in that same sort of category. And then it's very hard to give you, to articulate the distinction. I can just describe, and Zachariah, I think your point in the shuk is not a terrible one. There are certain situations that when I'm there, I know it's Kalut Rosh. You follow? So I observe, so when you walk through town, so sometimes the dynamic changes. You might have a group of guys that are all, hanging out together at some falafel stand, and then the dynamic changes when a group of girls joins that group of boys. That change in the dynamic is Kalut Rosh. You hear that? So it's not a word. It's not it's not something that I could articulate very well. It's more describing a scenario, and when you're there, that's Kalut Rosh, and that's really what the Gemara is describing over here. The problem, and this is important to connect to what you were saying earlier, that the problem is not about men seeing women or women seeing men. It's much more about communicating with one another, that we need to have an area for the men and an area for the women, so that the women are experiencing Simchat Beit HaShoeva in the company of other women, and the men are experiencing Simchat Beit HaShoeva in the company of other men. But the two groups can see each other. It's appropriate for me to experience that thing in the company of men. Does that make sense to you? Joy? Okay, I want to go from what we've seen until now. Our final source to introduce us to the topic, our final source is the Rambam. The Rambam, Maimonides, who really summarizes. As we see, the Rambam writes this in the laws of Sukkah. Now, the Rambam, as you know, as opposed to the Shulchan Aruch, when he wrote halacha, he didn't just write halacha for us today. We live without the Beit HaMikdash, but he wrote halacha for all time. So in the Shulchan Aruch, you will not find halachot pertaining to the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, because when the Shulchan Aruch was written, that was not a time that we were celebrating Simchat Beit HaShoeva in the Beit HaMikdash. But the Rambam, when he wrote his book of halacha, he wasn't just writing a book of halacha for that moment, he was writing a book of halacha for all time. And therefore, he includes in the Rambam, Mishneh Torah also talks about halachot pertaining to the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Joy. Good. So now look at what he says. Afal pi, shekol hamoadot mitzvah lismoch b'hem. There's a mitzvah to be happy on all the festivals. Chag HaSukkot hayta b'mikdash yom simcha yetera. It was a greater level of simcha on Sukkot, and he gives a pasuk to support that. V'keitzat hayosim. How did they celebrate? On the second line. Erev Yom Tov Rishon hayu metaknim b'mikdash makom lanashim milemala v'nashim lemata. The women would go in sort of a higher level on a platform. V'hanashim lemata, and the men were on the ground level. Kedei shelo yitarbu elu im ele. In order that they should be separate one from the other. You follow? It's this mixing which is a problem. No mention of tzniut yet, Yosef. ומתחילים לשמוח כמו יום טוב ראשון וכן בכל יום ויום בימי חול המועד. This was something done every day of חול המועד. מתחילים מאחר שהגרו תמיד של בין הרבים לשמוח ושאר היום עם כל הלילה. Often the dance would go on all the way through the night. So we see there are certain situations in which we want to avoid kalut rosh. You follow? Now I wonder whether we could imply that if kalut rosh was always wrong, so then men and women should never be together. You follow? Does that make sense to you? But we're told about it dafka during the time of the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, but it could be it was like a particularly jolly time, and it was a time that could lead to kalut rosh. But we don't get the sense, and this is important. This is the very, very difficult balance that we need to figure out. And hopefully the sources will help us get that balance. It's not bad for men and women to mix. But Ezrat Hashem, for all of you at the right time, you'll be blessed to stand under the chuppah with a kala, with a bride. And the only way to get to know her is through spending time with her. You follow? So the holiest connection is the connection between a husband and a wife. So it's very important for us to understand that we're not limiting mixing between men and women, saying when men and women are mixed together, that's bad. But we're saying that in certain situations it could lead to kalut rosh, and therefore men and women need to be separated. You follow? Is that clear? And you need real chokhmah to know when. I'll just tell you, similar to what I mentioned about children and creepy people, that you know. People have a sense, if it feels this is not really a very yeshiva sort of environment to be in, we normally know, like we have the sense of this is appropriate and I shouldn't really be here. You know what I mean? Okay. Let's go now. Based on the sources that we've looked at, we now come to one of the first people to write a very clear definition of what Mechitzah is, that separates men and women. And this is Rav Moshe Feinstein in his the first volume of his Igrot Moshe. He writes like this. בעניין המחיצה שצריך להיות בבית הכנסת בין הנשים לנשים ושיעור גובהה, the separation between men and women, and how big the mechitzah should be. And he quotes a Gemara that we saw in Sukkah, that we need to avoid kalut rosh. One second, let me just see if I can get to. Okay, I'm going to go to the second paragraph. Is that okay? Here, hayotze mizeh gam b'batei haknesiyot, in our batei knesset, shemitkabetzim sham anashim v'nashim litpalel, where men and women pray together. Tov yoter lasot gezus Torah. It's best to have two levels. So you have a level like we have here at Machon Meir. There's the men all pray on one level, and then you go up one floor, and the women pray on the floor above. שאנשים יהיו למעלה, ואם מאיזה טעם קשה לעשות כזו סורה, צריכים לעשות מחיצה ממש, כזו שתמנע מלבוא לידי קלות ראש. The purpose of the מחיצה is to avoid קלות ראש. ולא סגי במאי שנחשבה מחיצה לכל דבר כגון בשערים פתוחים, כמו שראינו שלא הועילה במקדש והיה אסור מדאורייתא. It's not good enough, let's say, to have like an open gate. Like a... because they had that in the Beit HaMikdash. I don't know, let's say, I don't know if any of you ever had rooms like this, but I'll give you an example from houses in England. Many houses in England, but this could mean absolutely nothing to any of you. You'd have like a very big, like main room, like a lounge dining room area. And it was often a long room with like doors in the middle. And the doors in the middle, if you close the doors, then you'd have like a dining room and then a lounge. And then if you'd open the doors in the middle, you'd have this long, long room. Anyone follow what I'm talking about? So, no. But let's say I were to open the doors, and you've got this long room, so you say all the men in one room, all the women in the other room. It's not good enough just to open the doors, even though it's clear, they went in this door and they got into this room, and they went to that door and they got into that room. But since there's nothing to separate them, I can stand next to you and shout with you, then that doesn't count as a mechitzah. A mechitzah has to be something that prevents kalut rosh. Now, how do you do that? If you're on the same level, so he says over here, you need to have a mechitzah that goes up to about your neck. It should be taller than your shoulders. Why? Because if I can see your head, we can't really, it's not really a position in which I can talk to you. If the mechitzah is like up to here, so then there's we'll just chat. I can hardly notice it. But having it up to my shoulders or above my shoulders is a very, very interesting ruling of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Why? Because he's obviously being very precise in saying above the shoulders. Because if it was, let's say, below my shoulders over here, so then there's more of a sense that we're in the same room. And if it's above my head, then it's more than it's like two different rooms. I can't see what's going on your side. You can't see what's coming on my side. By putting the height of the mechitzah as above the shoulders, what's he doing, Rav Moshe Feinstein? He is defining a mechitzah and what's the word? Sort of navigating that very narrow line between, on the one hand, separation, because that would avoid kalut rosh, but on the other hand, everybody can see what's going on. You follow? So the ideal is like what we have in Machon Meir, where the women are above, they can see everything that's going on below, and the men, everyone can see everything, but during davening, not that we would talk, chas v'shalom, but between like schmoozing on the way in and schmoozing on the way out, it will be the women schmoozing with the women and the men schmoozing with the men. It won't be mixed at that time, but everyone can see it. So then when we're all on the same level, I want to maintain that everyone can see it. So I'm not going to say the mechitzah has to be above your head, because then everyone can't see. But I can't have it lower than the shoulders, because if it's lower than the shoulders, then we're just like schmoozing, as if we were in the same space. You follow? So Rav Moshe Feinstein's recommendation for a mechitzah is it needs to be at least up to above the shoulders. Why? Because that would avoid kalut rosh. Now, if we go to the next piece, leficha gam bebate knesiot shelanu שמתקבצים להתפלל צריך שתהיה מחיצה, ודווקא מחיצה כזו שלא יבוא מתוכה לידי קלות ראש. In order to avoid kalut rosh, שהוא או בגזוסטרה, either the women above, or if you have a mechitzah over the shoulders. You follow? Is that clear, Rav Moshe Feinstein? Now, I want to add 2 points to what Rav Moshe Feinstein is saying. First of all, in reading Rav Moshe Feinstein, I now want to, what's the word? Clarify, or lechadat, to sharpen a little bit what I said earlier about the concept of kalut rosh. Because he says, we do this mechitzah in order that we would never get into a state of kalut rosh. So I want to tweak what I said earlier. I think his definition and our definition, kalut rosh is never a good thing. But if we're just chatting, Be'ezrat Hashem, when you meet a girl and you want to, to decide if we're going to get married, or even when you're chatting, you have fun and you can make jokes, but you're never in a state of kalut rosh. You follow? Kalut rosh seems to be a situation that I always want to avoid. It's a bit like being a bit frivolous, like a bit frivolous, not really like, I don't know, like presenting this persona that doesn't accurately reflect who I really am because of the people who are around me. You follow? That could be the kalut rosh, and I think that's something that he wants to avoid at all costs, and therefore you have to separate men and women at any situation that could lead to kalut rosh. Is that clear? But separate them with a barrier so they can't chat with each other. Now there are shuls, I've never seen it, but there is a shul in Manhattan, the Upper West Side, I think, where they have a Mechitzah following the guidelines of Rav Moshe Feinstein, but the Mechitzah is made out of glass. Because the problem, as he explains, is about a barrier. There seems to be no problem with looking. And even his very precise definition of how high Mechitzah needs to be indicates by saying above the shoulders, he's saying you can see each other, you shouldn't be chatting with each other. You follow? And therefore it seems that there should be no reason not to have a glass Mechitzah. It's not about looking, it's about chatting. Does that make sense to you? Okay, that's the first position. That's the position of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Any comments, thoughts on what we just read? Does it make sense to you? Do you have a clearer idea of what Kalut Rosh means? Joy? Okay, I want to add one thing before we move on to the next position, which is from Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg. But before we get to him, I want to quote to you something from Rav Shlomo Karlebach. Rav Shlomo Karlebach used to say such a sweet idea. And I have to say, often when I speak to boys who are thinking of entering the world of shidduchim, to decide who will have the honor of marrying these sweet, holy boys. This is a useful tip for you to think about in terms of our interaction with women. And Shlomo used to say like this. He used to define what's a good friend. A good friend, he said, is somebody who, when I'm in their company, I want to be a good person. And what does he mean by that? He means, and you all know this, there are certain people in our lives who draw out different emotions inside of us. Now, everybody here has got a story that's, everybody here, you could write a book about their story. But there are certain people that we meet who, when we're with them, I'm really happy with the person who's coming out of me, meaning I'm really happy with the person that I'm presenting to them. So that's a sign that they are a good person. You follow? That chas v'sholom, people shouldn't use bad language. But sometimes my language changes when I speak to this person as opposed to when I speak to that person. Sometimes I'm a little bit more refined, so a little bit more cautious, a little bit more aware when I'm in that person's company. A good friend, is somebody who, when I'm in their company, I want to be a good person. But my best friend, and this is the person you look for, Be'ezrat Hashem, my best friend is somebody who, just being in their company makes me a better person. You follow? They just bring out the good in me. Like I would never dream of lying when I'm with you. So I wouldn't want to hurt, and I speak differently, I daven differently, I look at the world differently. I look here but I don't look there. They have sort of an influence on me that brings out the strength, the good in me. You follow? I would suggest lahavdil. What?
Koved Rosh.
Koved Rosh, exactly. The lahavdil, there are certain people or situations that bring out the worst in me. Do you know what I mean? You're just like silly. And you say stuff you don't really mean it, but you think maybe someone's doing it. Do you know what I mean? That's kalut rosh. You know what I mean? So I want to avoid that inauthentic me. And certainly in tefillah, I mean, there's certain situations in which it might happen, and the point of the Mechitzah is to avoid kalut rosh. Then I should maintain my authenticity. Is that clear? The purpose of the Mechitzah, as based on everything we've seen until now, the basis of the Mechitzah is for me to allow me at all times to maintain my authenticity. Joy, happiness, Mekubal. Okay, now we're going to come to your point. Rav Yechiel Yaakov Epstein, Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, he lived in Switzerland. He's survived the Shoah. I think he passed away perhaps in the 1960s, maybe the 70s, but I think the 1960s. He wrote a book called Sridei Eish. Sridei Eish is the embers from the fire. And he's sort of writing as somebody who knew the Torah world before the Shoah. And he's like one of this little fragments that's left over after the Shoah. So he wrote many, many interesting tshuvot about sort of like the modern world and interacting with the modern world, and so the relationship between men and women is really a big issue in the modern world. So he writes, B'inyan Mechitzah be'ezrat Hashem, concerning the Mechitzah that separates between men and women. Do you see? It's on the first source on the second page. Okay, Hine Yatua. Everyone, I'm going to the second part of the first line. Everybody knows that the Rambam wrote, Umakom Anashim Lamala, Mimakom HaAnashim. The women should be upstairs and the men should be downstairs. Kadei Shelo Yistaklu HaAnashim Benashim. In order, now this is the first time we've seen this mentioned, that the men shouldn't look at the women. You follow? Meaning the action is going on downstairs, right? So, or even let's say my natural gaze is this way. I don't naturally look up. You follow? So if the women are below me, I would be looking down and I would be looking at the women, because I think that's where we would more naturally look. But to look up is something that I'd be less likely to do without, unconsciously. And therefore, the men are downstairs and the women are upstairs, in order that the men won't start looking up. You follow? But this is new. This is beyond the concept of Kalut Rosh that we were talking about. V'chein katav b'tosot Yom Tov sham, commenting on the Mishnah. Ulam behilchot lulav katav kadei shelo yitarvu elu me'elu. However, if you look in the Rambam, in one place he talks about that the men shouldn't look at the women, and in the other place he mentions that men shouldn't mix with the women. Uvemet amru b'midot kadei shelo yeh mu'uravin. It seems to be that the problem is that men and women shouldn't be mixed. However, he writes, Lefichach, so there seems to be the main issue, and that's really the issue that we've been learning until now, is we don't want men and women to be in mixed company, because a mixed company may lead to kalut rosh. But in addition to this issue of mixed company, there is also an element of people shouldn't be looking at each other. You follow? Now is very, very interesting. He writes, in Poland and in Lithuania, ein machmirim kol kach sharei hamitpalel omed umitpalel b'sidur ve'eno makbih einav lemala. He says, in countries like Poland and Lithuania, people are immersed in their prayers, and therefore the only necessity for the Mechitzah was to avoid kalut rosh. But I don't need to tell them that you shouldn't be looking at each other, because that's not what they would be doing anyway. Everybody's busy davening. However, in Ashkenaz is like France and Germany. Nagul hachmir. They were machmir, ובוודאי שיש כאן מצד חומרת המקום, ולכן אין לך אלא מקומו ושעתו. שבאם אפשר לתקן, ודאי שמצווה לתקן, אבל אין לעשות מחלוקת גדולה, להרוס קיבוץ של יראיהם בשביל הידור מצווה. כן הוא דעתי. So he says there seems to be two sort of customs. The one custom is in Poland and in Lithuania, where people seem to be very serious on their davening. there was separation between the men and women, but the men could see the women and the women could see the men, but they weren't looking. However, in France and Germany, in addition to the separation, there was also a curtain. Why? Because the purpose of the separation there wasn't just about separating between men and women to avoid kalut rosh, but there was also an issue of tzniut, that the men shouldn't be looking at the women shouldn't be looking at the men during the times of prayer. So you have a very, very strange situation. You have some countries where you have a mechitzah, the glass mechitzah, like the one I mentioned in the Upper West Side, where you have that sort of mechitzah because everyone's involved in davening. No one's looking at anybody. Everyone's just involved in davening. Therefore, all you need is a barrier, but it need not be a barrier that you can't see. It could be see-through. And there are other communities where you need more than a barrier because you don't want the men looking at the women, you don't want the women looking at the men, and therefore, in addition to a barrier, you also need like something to stop people looking at one another. And then the Sridei Eish says, I'm not going to get involved. Meaning, what he means by that is, I don't know, somebody was obviously asking him, what mechitzah do we need in our community? So each community follows a custom that they're used to. There's some communities where they will have a see-through because that's all they need, and in others will have a curtain, and each community should follow their custom. But what he has introduced is an element that we have not seen until now, and that is the purpose of the mechitzah isn't just to prevent us chatting with one another, but is also to prevent us being distracted from our prayers during davening. You follow? Okay. We're going to come to Rav Moshe Feinstein in a minute, but I want to add to the story of the Sridei Eish with something that happened to me actually. So Hannah and I, my wife and I, we got married in Liverpool. Now I come from London. And before we got married, we were going to have like after the wedding, you have a su'udat mitzvah. Like you have a wedding meal after the chuppah. So we were going to have a wedding meal. And after the wedding meal, we were going to have dancing. And obviously the dancing was going to be separate. Separate. We were going to have the men on one side dancing and the women on the other side dancing. And I spoke to my rabbi in London and asked him, what sort of mechitzah do we need for the dancing between the men and the women? Because at the time there were some people that had like a big mechitzah, like this big panels that no one could see. In other places, they just had like 4 balloons, and another place had like 2 plants. It was very varied, the type of mechitzah that people had to separate the men's dancing and the women's dancing at a wedding. Now there, of course, back to what you were saying, the concern there is not so much about the kalut. They're eating a meal together. It's more about looking, the men shouldn't look at the women shouldn't be looking at the men during the dancing. But anyway, when I asked my rabbi, Diane Binstock, I spoke to her. He was our family Rav in London, and he told me, really very similar to what the Sridei Eish is saying over here, that if you want to know what mechitzah you need for a wedding in Liverpool, you have to speak to the rabbi of Liverpool. So he said he didn't want to get involved, and it's really the same idea. Each community, assuming that the rabbi of the community is, a Yirei Shamayim, and it's somebody who understands halacha. So then you follow whatever is suitable for that community. So we then turn to the rabbi of the Liverpool Jewish community to find out how we should build the mechitzah, because he felt it wasn't right for a Rav from outside of the community to dictate the nature of the mechitzah in that community. You follow? Really very much following this line of the Sridei Eish. The different communities, the concern is the same. We want to avoid kalut rosh. We want to preserve tzniut. But each community understands what barriers need to be created in order to avoid kalut rosh and in order to maintain tzniut in their particular community. You follow? Okay. So far the Sridei Eish. Now, I want to go back to Rav Moshe Feinstein, our final source. Go to Rav Moshe Feinstein. We read Rav Moshe Feinstein at the beginning from his responsa on the laws of daily living, volume 1. We're now going to Rav Moshe Feinstein, the laws of daily living, volume 3. So this is obviously at a later stage. Now look at this. Look what he writes. Be'inyan Mechitzah, concerning the Mechitzah between men and women. Okay, this word. Ve'hinei levad inyan Mechitzah shezeu davar mechayev afilu nashim tznuot bioter. He said, you need the Mechitzah even if everybody is dressed appropriately. I want to avoid, and we saw that he mentioned this earlier, I want to avoid kalut rosh. Kalut rosh has got nothing to do, but kalut rosh can occur even in the most modestly dressed group of people. Meaning, it's my clothes are not enough to protect me from kalut rosh. You follow? You could be dressed, I know, in the most modest clothing and still behave with kalut rosh. So I need the mechitzah. I always need the mechitzah to prevent kalut rosh. However, yesh inyan mechitzah b'shvil isur histaklut mamash. But you need a second reason for the mechitzah is in order to prevent men looking at women and women looking at men. Sometimes people come into shul and they're not necessarily dressed appropriately. Some women come to shul without their hairs covered, and that's fine. Especially nowadays, because it's not considered as something immodest. Because many women around the world, don't have their hair covered. So it doesn't have the same impact as, it's not viewed as a lack of modesty. I mean, covering the laws of covering your hair for women is a topic that we're not going to get into now, and it's an important topic. I'm not sure how, in terms of our class and learning halachot, in terms of our priorities in this particular class, I don't think it's high on our list of priorities. That's really, Be'ezrat Hashem, your soulmates will decide, what they need to do. But nowadays, when we think of modesty, it's normally referring more to the clothing that we wear on our bodies and less about a hair covering. So he's saying, you don't need the mechitzah in order to prevent me looking at a woman whose hair isn't covered. But there are other areas, there are other ways that women could come inappropriately dressed that would require this second aspect of the mechitzah, and the glass mechitzah wouldn't be enough in this situation, because it's about looking at one another, and that's what we're here to avoid. That's what we're here to avoid. He says over here, Aval harbe nashim ba'avonotenu harabim holchot bizruot megulot v'chadoma shezeu v'adai hu bedin erva she'asur litpalel kenegdan. Women go to shul with bare arms, and that's certainly something that you shouldn't be praying in that sort of environment. So that's why we have the mechitzah until the neck. If I had a glass mechitzah, that would help me. That would help me for the separation. Meaning, the Mishnah that we looked at in Sukkah, a glass mechitzah would be fine for that. However, it wouldn't be okay for your concern of tzniut. Meaning, I don't say glass isn't a barrier in terms of erva. Somebody is dressed inappropriately, so glass is not a barrier that would allow me to pray in front of them. And therefore, Rav Moshe Feinstein adds a second element to the requirement for a mechitzah, and that is the Isur Histaklut, that you're not allowed to look at certain things. And nowadays, really, unfortunately, probably in most Batei Knesset, it could be that we have to be concerned about both aspects, both about interaction, chatting with one another, but also the Isur of Histaklut, of looking, and therefore a Mechitzah needs to be built in such a way that would prevent interaction and also prevent distraction from prayer if somebody would chas v'shalom look at things that you shouldn't be looking at. Is that clear? So that's Rav Moshe Feinstein's second point. Okay, so far, in terms of halacha concerning the Mechitzah, primarily in shul. I just want to mention, just to conclude, about separation between men and women in other situations. So I'll tell you two situations. I remember when I was a child, we used to go to like concerts. I mean, not like a Jewish concerts, like Avram Fried and Mordechai Ben David, all these sorts of people. They've been singing for many, many years. And when I was a kid, we used to go to concerts in London, and it was all mixed seating. Nowadays, it's either the concert is entirely for men, or the concert is entirely for women, or there's there's one area for all the men and another area all for the women. So I'm not sure what happened. The truth is, I can understand that very, very well. When we go to a concert, people are jumping up and down and they're dancing. It's interesting because, sort of each generation, takes on different mitzvot. And even though I grew up certainly in a very observant environment, people were Shomrei Torah mitzvot, and in some cases, it's even the same singers that had certain criteria 30 years ago, and they've got new criteria now. That they will sing that then they would have sung in a particular setup, and now they wouldn't sing in the same setup. I wonder whether things are changing, or Am Yisrael are taking certain things more seriously. It's also true in the context of weddings. Sometimes weddings are mixed, and sometimes weddings are separate. And I can really see the value sometimes in this avoidance of kalut rosh at a separate wedding. Sort of when the Machon Me'ir boys go to a wedding and then you sit on a table with the guys, that's an entirely different experience to if you were to go to a wedding and then you would sit in a mixed environment. It'll be a totally different experience. And even though 20 years ago, 30 years ago, most weddings were mixed, and now most weddings are separate, but it's the same families with the same background, but it seems to be, I don't know what it is, like something changing in general society, and this necessity for us to ensure that the mixing between men and women takes place within in appropriate contexts. It could be that kalut rosh has become a greater concern than it once was, and therefore situations that may not have sparked kalut rosh previously do spark kalut rosh nowadays. I'm not sure. It's certainly a trend that there's more separation today than there once was. But I'm not necessarily sure it's a bad thing, because it does seem to prevent kalut rosh. And now when you go there, you see that it's a different experience. You mean like going to a wedding where, I'm not talking about, like married couples, if they sit together, that's one thing. But I'm saying like the guys, the yeshiva guys, when you go to a wedding, the experience to go as a group of guys is different to if you were to go to a mixed wedding. And even though many years ago that is not something that people took so seriously, nowadays people do take it seriously. Just want to summarize, I don't know, basically everything into like 2 or 3 sentences to explain this very, very narrow line that we need to draw. Because Be'ezrat Hashem, it's very important for you all to understand that the most important relationship in your life, Be'ezrat Hashem, will be the relationship between a man and a woman, between a chatan and a kala, Be'ezrat Hashem, for all of you. And that's the deepest, holiest relationship. So it's obviously something that we celebrate and we build and we treat it with reverence. So we have to find that narrow line on the one hand to understand that it's the holiest thing, so that the men and women mixing is not something that's never appropriate. Families are created. It's Be'ezrat Hashem, you'll meet your spouse through mixing with a woman. But on the other hand, there does seem to be this concern of both kalut rosh, that we've seen that's been spoken about for a long time, and then also the issue of tzniut, that maybe these issues are becoming more prevalent. Kalut rosh is becoming something that's more prevalent today than it was in the past. Maybe there was a certain people more reserved, perhaps earlier, and they're less reserved now. So I need to protect myself more against kalut rosh today than I once did. And maybe tzniut is also changing. That I would walk in the street in one way a long time ago, and I walk differently now. But the result is that I think that the values have remained the same. It remains the same concerns, kalut rosh and tzniut. Just as the world changes, so halakha tweaks in order to maintain our standards. And I just conclude with a blessing for all of us. We should have the wisdom to navigate this difficult path of interaction within society, that we should have the chokhmah to get it right. And through that, Be'ezrat Hashem, to build some beautiful Jewish homes. Yishar koach to